Hi everyone, this is Dr. Pollock. Haven't had a chance to talk to you guys in a while. Hopefully you remember what my voice sounds like since I don't currently have a webcam hooked up. Maybe that'll happen in the future. I haven't been able to access my office in a little while, which is where my webcam is. So for now, voice only. Anyway, the point of this video is, first of all, as you can see on the screen right now, I want to discuss in more detail how our class is being restructured for the online format we'll be using going forward. Toward the end of the video, I'll have a few things I also want to wrap up with in terms of our discussion of political knowledge, which we left off before spring break. We are going to just a few items I wanted to touch on there to wrap up that discussion. First of all, like I said, the main point of this video is going to be to discuss how the class is being restructured. And to that note, first of all, you'll realize here that you're listening to a pre-recorded video, right? So here, this is going to be the primary means by which I convey lecture material here going forward for the remainder of the semester. Pre-recorded, importantly, on-demand lecture videos. Okay, so this is something you recall I advertised earlier in one of my emails I sent out to the class that I was thinking about doing Zoom lecture sessions during the normal class period, right? So Monday, Wednesday, 3 p.m. to 4:15 p.m. I opted against that in the end here just because I received some feedback from students in this class, students in my other two classes about concerns with being available on Moodle in front of a computer at a specific time frame given the interruptions everyone's having to their lives, right? So in other words, I've decided to change to this pre-recorded format for our lecture discussions just to give people an opportunity to listen to the material or watch the material at their own convenience, right? And so to this end, I'll be putting out these videos on this YouTube playlist I linked on Moodle, where you would have access this. You'll be seeing at least one of these new videos per week with lecture material on it, and I'll send out an email announcement every time I have a new one for you. But yeah, you guys, you can consider these videos mandatory, right? So you're expected that when I put a new video out, you'll attend to it within a day or a few days when you get the chance to do so. That being said, you can do so at your convenience. If you're somebody who has a situation that's preventing you or from being available at a specific time, or you're uncertain about what your future schedule will look like, given the current situation, you can watch these and listen to these whenever you get the chance to. Beyond that, okay, so the downside, of course, to pre-recorded lectures is going to be that they are non-interactive, of course, right? So this is the main downside of this format. It's something that in general, I think a face-to-face format is better regardless of what we're doing online. I think face-to-face has better potential for interaction and more productive interaction. That being said, I do want to give you guys opportunities to stay in touch with me and discuss things with me whenever needed. And so the second thing I wanted to note in terms of how the class is being restructured is that I'm going to begin holding virtual office hours using the Zoom software. And I will have, for this class, a specific time frame, Wednesdays during our normal class period. So every Wednesday for the remainder of the semester between 3 p.m. and 4:15 p.m., I will be in a Zoom room, and I'll post a link on the Moodle page where you'll be able to access it to where you can drop in and discuss with me any questions you have about lecture material on one of these videos, something not covered on the videos, questions about class, questions about projects, anything that you have a concern with. You can come by in the Zoom room and talk to me about it. Otherwise, if Wednesdays between 3 p.m. and 4:15 don't work for you, I would say feel free to make an appointment by email with me to where we can set up a time and you can come talk to me. Like everyone else, I'm spending most of my time, not everyone else necessarily, but like many of you, I'm probably going to be spending most of my time at home here, following guidelines in Wake County and national guidelines in terms of how we're supposed to comport ourselves. And so I will have a lot of time on my hands. So anytime within normal working hours, I can probably accommodate, but just let me know by email if you want to talk to me at some other point in time. So this is going to be the primary means by which we interact, right? You'll be watching these videos, and when you have questions, these are not mandatory sessions, but I would imagine most of you at some point in the semester are going to want to talk to me about things that are going on in the class through Zoom office hours or through otherwise Zoom appointments. Beyond that, this is not something that's news necessarily. You would have ideally been paying attention to your email prior to our interruption, but I just want to reiterate a lot of what I'm going to convey to you in terms of what's going on in the class and any potential changes to the class is going to be done through email. And so please pay attention to your NC State email. Make sure you're checking on a regular basis. If you need to talk to me, an email is the best way to do so for you. Please be in touch by email. This is going to be an important tool going forward in the class and a new online format we're instituting. Okay, so beyond this, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of assignments going forward, what we're going to be doing, and then I'll talk a little bit about grading in the class. Okay, these are both things that are changing a little bit. Some of this news I've given you by email already. Some will be new here. So first of all, to summarize our assignments here, the things that you're going to be doing online here going forward, we are still going to have a final exam as I anticipated. This would be administered online, and you can also anticipate getting a lot more information about the exam as we get closer to the exam date. So you can expect to have a review sheet. If we want to have a review session, that's something I'd be willing to schedule. So just wanted to put that on your radar that we are still going to have a final. It will be administered online remotely, but you will still have a final exam in the class. For most of the readings you'll be doing through the remainder of the semester, you'll also have QQCs, so this should not be anything unfamiliar to you at this point. Whenever I'm assigning a new article for you guys to read through, I will probably also assign a QQC. In fact, toward the end of the video here, I'll talk about the QQC you'll be doing for this Wednesday on this paper I assigned by Iyengar, Peters, and Kinder on media agenda setting. Right? So it'll be the next QQC you have to do, the next assignment you actually have to do in the class. And then finally, I sent out this email on the final project, which I think it bears repeating the information that was in that email. Hopefully you all would have read it by now, but I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. The primary changes here, just to go to what I distributed earlier in the semester, these guidelines for the paper. The primary changes are thus. I talked about how we're getting rid of part 3, which is the Qualtrics programming, which is regrettable. I think this was, it's something like I mentioned in class that I wanted you guys to do just to get some practical skills and relevance for this class, things that could perhaps go on your resume and be applied in future work settings, which I think most of you probably are fairly comfortable with at least these basic elements of Qualtrics recovered so far, right? So I think all of you at this point should know how to program a basic survey instrument in Qualtrics, and a lot of it, if there's other things you want to learn, a lot of it you're able to learn on your own. I'll be here if you want to talk about Qualtrics going forward in the semester. What I didn't want to do here, though, is have this source of anxiety of the software that some of you may still not be fully comfortable with. I didn't want it to be out there to where you guys run into problems and I'm not effectively able to address your problems with the software, right? Because in this sort of software and most software, it's difficult if I'm on Zoom and you're on Zoom for you to describe what the issue is you're having, for me to diagnose the issue and help you. It's much easier when we're learning software, at least in my experience. If somebody brings in their laptop, they can show me what's going on and I can sit down and tell them exactly what's happening, how to fix the issue, right? So we got rid of this part 3 Qualtrics. Again, if you have anything else you want to talk about with respect to this software, I'd be more than happy to do so with you. What you're going to be focusing on here are parts 1 and part 2. The parameters of these parts of the project are not really changing as far as I can say so far. Part 1, you're developing your research question theory, hypothesis, putting these into this document. Part 2, your research design, it's still going to be a survey experiment. You're still going to be providing all the details for your survey experiment and eventually providing as an appendix a questionnaire showing exactly what the questions are going to be, what the treatments are going to look like. So you're still doing everything in designing this study for the final project, just not programming it in Qualtrics. Okay, and this is something to where, again, if you have questions about it, you want to stay in touch with me. I'm still in the process of sending out feedback in terms of your proposals here. But again, this is something we want to stay in touch with either by email or in our Zoom office hours going forward. The final change here is that all this is now due on April the 20th, the final document with both these parts. I'm not requiring drafts anymore, but if you want to submit a draft, I would encourage you to do so. In fact, even if you don't want to submit a draft, I would encourage you to get working on your project and submit anything. It can be a full draft, it can be an outline, it can be whatever to me, and let me give you feedback. The sooner you get whatever you're saying to me, the better. So if you get me a draft of the full paper the night before it's due, probably not at that point in a position to really provide great actionable feedback. If you give me something a week before the paper's due, that's great, and I can probably provide you a lot of information in terms of what, maybe what's lacking, what could be improved, that sort of thing. So just because drafts are no longer mandatory, I would still encourage you to submit them. Again, though, the decision not to require the drafts is, again, just pursuant to giving maximum flexibility, maximum accommodation to anybody who's perhaps in an uncertain situation or in a situation that doesn't allow them to really schedule regular submission of these different assignment components, right? So this is all due on April the 20th. You'll be submitting it remotely on Moodle, which we'll talk more about if we need to. It shouldn't be any surprise, but anticipate the due date here, and I would encourage you to try to make progress as quickly as you can on that. Okay, getting back to the list of things that are changing here or new components of the class, I want to talk a little bit about grading. The primary change here relative to what's listed on the syllabus is we have this section on quizzes. We have a quiz average, which was to account for 15% of the final grade. So prior to spring break, we only had 2 quizzes in the class. We were planning on having, or I was planning on having, a few more, probably several more post spring break, which I don't think I'm going to do here in the online format. It's sort of questionable usefulness at this point, having online quizzes. And so I'm going to redistribute this 15%. So you've taken the 2 quizzes so far. Let me talk about how this grade component, the 15%, is going to be redistributed. First of all, I'm going to take 5% of that. This is be 15% of your final course average was meant to be in quizzes. I'm going to take that and divide it into 3 other components. The first of which I'm taking 5%, and I'm adding this to your in-class assignments. So the group assignments that we did several of them, many of them I would say, not just several, when we were meeting in person. I'm going to take those assignments. I'm going to take the 2 quizzes that you've completed. I'm going to put those in a bin, take the average score, and I'm going to take the 5% that was here and one of the 5% and put it here into this new average score. So in other words, we go to our syllabus, which I have handy somewhere over here. Okay, so you note here, the in-class assignments were meant to be 10%. That's now going to be a 15% component, and that's also going to include those 2 quizzes you took. I'm still going to drop the lowest, either quiz or assignment. So that if you miss one of these, that's fine. I may drop 2 at this point. We'll see. But that's one of the ways that 15% for the quizzes is going to be redistributed. Another 5% here is going to go to the highest out of your test 1, the midterm in other words, and your final. So you haven't taken the final yet, but I'm going to take, once I get those grades in. I'm going to see what your grade in the test one was. I'm going to see what your grade in the final exam was. And whichever one is the highest, in other words, to your benefit, I'm going to take 5% of what wants to be the quiz average and distribute it into this bin, whichever bin has the highest score for you. And then finally, the final project is going to be another 5%. So you haven't turned in the final project, but 15% of this former quiz grade is going to, 5% of this former quiz grade is going to be added to your final project. So again, going back to the syllabus here, final project was, the semester project was 20%. That's going to go to 25% of the final grade average. I don't like to make these sort of changes, just to give you insight into my thinking. When I teach a class, my preference is to have the grade scale set beforehand at the beginning of the semester and never change it. I don't know that I've ever made this sort of change before in any other class that I've taught, but these are obviously pretty unique circumstances. And so this is the primary change that I anticipate making, this redistribution. That being said, in terms of grading, I wanted to highlight a few other bits of information. These next two that I sent out via one of my previous emails. So the university is offering universal satisfactory or unsatisfactory grading as an option for students in all of the classes this semester. Okay. What this means is that if you get a C minus in the class, that's the lower threshold. If your final average is a C minus or better, you can opt into just having a satisfactory score rather than your letter grade. And this would just mean you get the credit for the class for your major, you get the credit for your graduation requirements. You do not have this class changing your GPA, though. It would just be an S on your score, on your transcript, and it would not change your GPA at all. And so that's one option. If for whatever reason the grading changes aren't to your liking, or the grading just doesn't work out the way you want it, there is the pass-fail option being offered by the university. University is also offering late drops. So if something, I hope no one has to avail themselves of this option, but it is there. If you're somebody who, for whatever reason, the class at this point really doesn't go the way you want it, or there's something in your life that's affecting your ability to fulfill the requirements of the course, this would be an option. Again, from my perspective, I don't think there should be any reason from what I'm talking about at the moment that this would be necessary, but I just wanted to list these two options that the university is offering. And I think these are both good decisions on the university's part, right? This is the type of thing to where me and your other instructors are probably trying to minimize the changes necessary in each class. But there are, just by the demands of the situation, there are changes that are happening. And so if it's something that's negatively affecting your ability to succeed in the class or complete the class requirements, these are options available. The final note here on these, I would say though, make sure if either of these options are things that you consider or thinking about potentially down the road, you want to be in touch with your advisor. I am not at this point acting in an official advisory capacity. I'm just putting these options on your radar in the event that you want to think about them more on your own. I'm not saying anything beyond just that these are options available that the university has put into place. Okay. The next thing I wanted to talk about just briefly would be the remaining topics we're going to cover in the class. So we're at the point in which, given the delays in the class, we're not going to get through every single item on the syllabus, unfortunately. And so I'm prioritizing a little bit. My plan here going forward, first of all, in this video, we're going to wrap up our discussion on political knowledge, which is something we began discussing and doing a group activity on in the semester prior to us leaving. My next line of priority, given that, here we're on the syllabus, given that the class is called Public Opinion and the Media, we haven't talked a ton yet about the media. It's been sort of incidental. It's come up, from time to time, but it hasn't been the focus so far. I want to focus the time we have now to the end of the semester on the media primarily, right? So we're going to be doing, you would have gotten the email with your next reading assignment. So maybe you guessed this. We're going to be focusing on this block of material here. starting with this Iyengar, Peters, and Kinder paper on agenda setting in the media. We later on, this will be the next reading, which I'll let you know when you need to start thinking about this. Chong and Druckmann, framing in the media. We talked a little bit about framing, but this is going to be a paper about competitive frames, to where you have arguments on framing an issue one way and the other. How do the competing frames interact? And then finally, incivility in the political media. Right? So this is something that we can all probably think of examples of that we've been exposed to, either politicians or media, members, reporters, or anchors, or whoever, acting in an uncivil manner before the electorate. How does that influence things? So this block here is what we're going to, at least I'm going to aim to cover in the remainder of the semester. I think that's a good goal to set. If we have more time, maybe we'll get into some of these other things we sort of skipped over, like misinformation or polarization or public policy. Some of you in your projects, maybe these items are relevant for you to read about, for that purpose, and I'd be happy to talk more about them. If you want to send me an email and just let me know. Otherwise, we can probably think about starting here with the media. Okay, so just getting back to our notes. Wrapping up knowledge today in this video, and then various topics in the media going forward. Okay. And so I think that is about what I wanted to talk about in terms of our restructuring. If there's more that I think I want to say on this note at a later date, I'll either put it in another video or I'll put it in an email. If you have questions, please let me know. Questions, concerns, comments, again, either through an email or once we start our Zoom office hours. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but the Zoom office hours, I'll have a link for those on Moodle, to where assuming the technology works as I'm expecting it to, you should be able to just click on and show up in the Moodle or the Zoom room through the Moodle link. Again, just a point, if you have questions, comments, concerns, please get in touch with me. I'll be happy to consider them. And like I said, I'm trying to be as accommodating as possible throughout this process of shifting to an online format. Right? That's what I wanted to say about the restructuring of the class. Let me move on now to, again, wrapping up this discussion on political knowledge. We were talking about this Barabas et al. Paper. I'm part of the et al. If you've looked at the authors list, so I'll actually show you some of the data that I helped put together for this paper in a little bit. Anyway, so we got through most of this discussion to where the primary insight of the article is just that there are different types of political knowledge, and people become knowledgeable in different ways depending on what type of knowledge we're talking about. Right? So it's not as though we're just talking about political knowledge as just a universal category. It's worth getting into a finer detail, finer granularity, if you will, into various types of knowledge. So in terms of the authors here, they're separating things out into two dimensions, just to refresh. The temporal dimension, the time, in other words, dimension. Is this an item of knowledge that was established recently, to where maybe you would have had to have learned about it, in other words, recently to be knowledgeable? Or is this more of a static item of knowledge in which maybe it's something you could have learned a long time ago, going through school, going through college, and it stays the same? So that's one dimension. And then we have the topical dimension. Is this just a general item of political knowledge, a general item about who holds an office, what does a particular office do, what are the institutions of government, things like this, versus a policy-specific item of knowledge, which this is a descriptive term in this case, an item of knowledge dealing with some area of policy, right? Sort of explicitly dealing with Social Security or healthcare, Medicare, or something like that. Something that we can point to a specific policy content being the baseline, the basis of the factual content, right? It's dealing with policy rather than some general factual item. And so here, if you recall in class, we talked about these three factors. That this is not the authors putting this word, but just political or public opinion researchers in general pointed these broad factors in terms of determining one's knowledge or ignorance of a particular piece of political fact. The ability, the opportunity, the motivation. Where ability, we're talking about cognitive ability, the capability to look at a piece of information and make sense of it. Okay, this may be probably not usually intelligence in this case, because we're not talking about things that are that complex, but just the ability to think through having contextual knowledge to make sense of what you're hearing. Ability. Opportunity. This is a pretty literal term. The opportunity. Have you actually encountered the information? Okay, so if there's something going on, something, for example, I don't know, Donald Trump resigns tomorrow. Okay, we would probably all hear about it. We'd probably all have the opportunity. On the other hand, if it's something involving, Donald Trump signs an obscure executive order that never gets any media attention, we may not have the opportunity to actually learn about that information. Right? So the actual, possibility of learning whatever we're talking about, that's what opportunity means. And then motivation, motivation, do we have the desire to learn about politics? Okay, so we might have the ability, we might have the opportunity, but if we're just somebody who just doesn't care that much about politics, we're probably not going to be that informed. Okay, so this is in large part just an individual level factor. How interested are you in the information we're talking about? Again, so these are the three things, again, in general, that political scientists have identified as influencing political knowledge. In terms of applying this in terms of the way the authors are applying this, the insight here is that when we look at different types of political knowledge, the antecedents, the causes, what's causing somebody to become knowledgeable about each type of knowledge is probably different, right? So here, for instance, education is one major factor that public opinion scholars often point to as influencing political knowledge. Here, Barabas et al. Are saying that this is probably most applicable to general static information, right? So if you're somebody who goes to school and you graduate from high school, you go to college, you're learning a bunch of different types of general static information, right? So things like, what does the First Amendment say? What is the term of office for a United States senator? Okay, these are things that if you're in my PS411 class, for example, you'd learn, right? Or you'd learn at some other point prior to that class. These are not changing. These are the things that if you learn them in 1 year, 20 years down the line, they'll be the same and you'll know them. And so education, the authors, based on the data set that they collect, they find that those that are more educated specifically are more knowledgeable in general static pieces of knowledge, right? Where education has less of a role are these surveillance items. Okay, so this would be something to where, tomorrow some new laws passed. Do you know about the law? It didn't exist prior to tomorrow. So if something's passed tomorrow, you have to actually be paying attention to the news to encounter the information, to have the opportunity, in other words, what we talked about, the opportunity to learn about it. So this is in large part not going to be based on education. It's going to be based on what the media is covering. Okay, do they choose to cover this new law? In the extent to which you're exposed to the media. So the media is covering something, but if you're somebody who just doesn't watch political media, nonetheless, you would not encounter the new information. Okay, so the media is most closely tied to knowledge about surveillance items. These items that are not fixed, where the underlying fact has changed recently, or maybe just by its nature tends to change a lot over time. Another good example here would be the unemployment rate. It's a surveillance item. Okay, if you're somebody who was paying attention to the unemployment rate a month ago, okay, that would say one thing. If you look at the unemployment rate next month in April, where it's reporting March unemployment, that would be the first Friday in April. It's going to be a dramatically different number. Okay, so you would have had to be paying attention to the media or what's going on in the actual world to know what the underlying fact is, the unemployment rate. Okay, so that's one insight that the authors put forward. The final thing I wanted to talk about, we mentioned this gender gap issue, to where, again, this isn't. I want to emphasize this is not speaking to general intelligence or anything like that. It's just an empirical pattern where you look at knowledge questions. This isn't just our data set in this Barabas et al. Paper or A single data set is a robust finding in public opinion literature that men and women tend to answer correctly on these knowledge questions at differential rates. Okay, for whatever reason, and I'll talk about a few of them, men tend to answer correctly at a higher frequency than women do, okay, across a number of different data points. And political science scholars have put forward a number of different explanations, one of which involves socialization. So maybe women are less socialized to be interested in politics than men. Again, these reasons I'm telling you all have some resonance. Socialization is one answer. There's research that points to different propensities toward guessing on public opinion surveys. So for example, if you have a question that says, you know, who is the vice, let's not say that. Let's see, who is the Secretary of State? This would be probably a relatively hard question for most people who aren't closely following politics. And let's say you set up the question to be, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, the correct answer, or say Ben Carson. Here's the Housing and Urban Development Secretary. And then let's say you have this final option, don't know. This is a fairly common, and if you see my pen jittering, I need to replace the tip, but hopefully you can read this somewhat. You see a question like this, it's a fairly common format for knowledge questions on political surveys. Public opinion scholars have found that men and women guess at differential rates. So if you're a woman who, let's say you get this question and you don't know the answer, you might say don't know. If you're a man, you're more likely to guess one of the three. Okay, so the way this results in differential correct answers is that just guessing at random, you have a 1 in 3 chance in this question of getting the correct answer, right? You pick A, B, or C, you have a 1/3 chance of picking Mike Pompeo, which is the correct answer. Whereas if you say don't know, you're being honest, which is good from the perspective of the researcher, but you don't have any chance of getting being marked as correct. Right? So there's differential rates of guessing among men and women. This is one thing that public opinion scholars have put forth as a potential explanation for the gender gap. There's been recent research by, two of the authors on this paper, Barabas et al., Barabas and Jarrett. They have a separate a separate paper on political knowledge looking specifically at the gender gap, where they are providing information, so sort of equalizing the opportunity side of things, providing information to men and women, and then seeing how learning progresses. And when men and women are exposed to the same information, learning happens sort of the same, right? So again, it's not an issue of cognitive ability at this case, differences in that respect. There's just something else going on, but that's another bit of research that's happened recently, that men and women exposed to the same information oftentimes are just going to be equalized in terms of their knowledge. In terms of this paper, what we're reading here, Barabas et al., 2014, our main point as far as gender goes is just, again, getting to different types of knowledge questions. We identify various types of questions that we refer to as gendered. Okay, so types of questions to where they have relevance to women specifically. Okay, so here, this is a spreadsheet, which I mentioned I'm one of the authors on this paper. One of my roles here was I'm in charge of all of the data, so I'm the person taking these questions and reformatting them and managing them. So this is just a spreadsheet showing all the different questions we use, and in particular, this part of the spreadsheet is showing all these questions that we identified as gendered. Okay, so specifically having relevance to women or women's politics. So for example here, a question asking, I'm asking you about some people who have been in the news recently. If you don't know who this person is, just tell me and we can move on. It says, can you tell me who Hillary Rodham Clinton is? Okay, somebody who's notable for being, among other things, the first female presidential nominee for either party, the first, I don't know what else she's been first, but obviously she's a very notable woman on the political scene. And so here, this is something we coded as a gendered question. I'm sure she's been the first of many things. I don't think she's the first female Secretary of State. I think it would be Madeleine Albright. Anyway, Condoleezza Rice is another example of who was this, and you know that these are not. This is a 2008 question when she was Secretary of State. Who is Condoleezza Rice? So a couple of these questions involve prominent female politicians. There are a few others that are different than that. So for example, so here's one. I'm going to read you, ask your opinion on some different topics, give you your best guess. First, which of the following kills one woman every minute, every day around the world? The answer is childbirth. In this case, this is a question dealing specifically with healthcare policy that's affecting women. Here we've got a couple of questions. This in the context of healthcare reform, the Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, whatever you want to call it. A couple of different things here. So this is asking about different provisions which are or are not in the bill. This one about prohibiting insurance companies from charging women higher premiums. This one about abortion. And so these are just all the questions. We don't have a ton. We have close to 300 questions, out of which about 25 are gendered. So maybe that's something else we could talk about. Whether whether it could potentially be the case that we're not asking enough gendered questions in these knowledge surveys. We identified these set of questions and we analyzed those separately from the others. And that's where this figure comes into play, figure 4. And I'm not going to, I guess, explain the details of, if you try to read through the paper, there's some pretty complex statistical analysis happening here. What I would say is just that, on each of these, each solid line for each sort of subgraph within this figure is the average for that type of question. And then the various gray lines are individual questions, right? It's a type of thing to where you try to take a lot of individual questions and come to a central tendency using our statistical analysis, which I'm not going to get into the details of it, right? What you note here is just that, women are on the left side of each figure, men on the right side, and here we're charting the percentage correct, okay, the percentage who actually are knowledgeable on a particular issue. The left side here, non-gendered questions, and you see in each of these quadrants, you have an upward slope, the upward slope indicating that women on the left side are answering the question, this type of question, correctly at a lower frequency than men are. Okay, so this is for non-gendered questions, and that's pretty much the same across all the different subtypes of questions here. When we look at our gendered questions here, okay, that's everything going on in this column, the right side here. You see that the pattern either, at least for 3 out of the 4 here, either reverses or equalizes, right? So here, for this chart, the line is about straight, which means men and women answering at the same rate. Same here. I think actually none of these, not to get too far into the statistics, but there aren't statistically significant differences in any of these 3 graphs between men and women. And then in this one here, you see not a ton of data points, but at least for this, the couple data points we do, women are actually answering at correctly at a higher rate than men. And so the takeaways here are just, first of all, it would be nice to have more data points to analyze, more questions dealing specifically with gendered questions. But in this case, what we're arguing is that we're seeing motivation differences probably go more in favor of women, that women on many of these questions are more motivated to actually learn about the items of knowledge. And so you're seeing less difference, or in some cases, favorable difference for women compared to men in terms of their political knowledge on these items. Okay, so that's a key takeaway as far as political knowledge goes among the gender gap in political knowledge for this paper. Like I said, this is a very large area of literature within public opinion and political knowledge discussions. And so there's a lot more to be said about the gender gap, but this is what this paper is saying about it. That when you account for motivation, when you give a specific motivation toward women, or not, when you look at things, I should say, that have specific motivation toward women, we're not giving them that. But when you look at items of knowledge to which women are particularly motivated to learn about, the gender gap tends to disappear. Okay. And so that's what I wanted to wrap up with as far as political knowledge goes. If you have questions about this, anything I've talked about in the lecture, or anything I talked about prior to this point, in the previous discussion about how the class is being restructured, again, let me know either through email or once we get started with our Zoom virtual office hours. You can get in touch with me that way. The final thing I wanted to point out here is we're going to move on, and if you have not already done so, this is the next paper we're going to read about. This paper, Experimental Demonstrations of the Not So Minimal Consequences of Television News Programs by Iyengar, Peters, and Kender. This paper does a number of interesting things, which is, I think it's a good jumping off point in terms of our discussion of the media. It walks you through sort of the history of what scholars have said about media influence on public opinion, and it sort of gets you to a discussion of what happens when we sort of look at things from an experimental approach. This is one of the major insights to this paper, that it's not often going to be enough to just look at things from an observational perspective. We've talked about the difference there. Observational just meaning, we look at what sort of media are people exposed to and what do their attitudes look like, and compare that. That's not always going to get us toward an accurate causal picture of what the media is doing. What we actually need to do is run an experiment in which us as researchers, we are manipulating the media environment. Okay? This is part of the reason, one of the broad reasons why we're in our semester paper doing a survey experiment rather than just a survey, right? One of the major advantages of a survey experiment is greater causal inference compared to just an observational research approach. So this paper is going to talk about a lot. If you have not already read it, go ahead and do so as soon as you can. There's going to be a QQC here due, and the parameters of this assignment, the QQC, aren't really going to change a lot compared to what we've done already with our QQCs. This will be due on Wednesday, which would be April the 1st. I'm going to relax the time dynamic of our due date. So in other words, I don't need it to be due at a particular, by noon or whatever, because we're not actually meeting. I don't need to read these before our class. So I'm going to let the due date be just midnight. So anytime on April the 1st, read the paper, write the QQC, and this will be the discussion here in the next lecture I have, the next one of these lecture videos that I put out. Anyway, again, thanks everyone. Get in touch with me if you have questions going forward, and I will talk to you again at some point soon. Stay safe, stay responsible, and I'll see you guys later.